Well, it was July the 10th that I was going to preach a sermon and I changed my mind. And I told you, well, we'd get back to it when we get back to it. Well, it's about 10 weeks later and we're finally getting back to it. Okay, so anyway, if you were here on July the 10th and you were really excited about hearing a sermon on the 3 loves of a disciple, and were disappointed when you heard about Green Valley Bible Camp, then today's your day, okay? So we're gonna talk about the 3 loves of a disciple. You know, in the Great Commission, Jesus wanted his apostles to make disciples. Matthew 28:19 and 20. Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age." A disciple is a learner, is a follower, is an adherent. Jesus wants us to learn from him and from his teachings of them. Matthew 11:28 through 30, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus wants us to learn from him and learn about him. But what does Jesus expect of us? Discipleship is a complex thing. It involves many different things. One of those things that it involves, though, is that we are to obey everything that he has commanded us. But especially one of those commands is love. If you look at Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, we learn a little bit about the love that we are commanded to have. Paul writes, "Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony." But as we read that, we might have some questions that pop into our heads. What are we to love, and how can we best display this love that we are to have? Specifically, the 3 loves that we are to have. Well, this morning I hope to answer these questions. And we start by saying, okay, well, the 3 loves of a disciple, what are they? So what are the 3 loves that are as they are defined? 3 things that a disciple is to love. And the first is they are to love the Lord. A disciple loves the Lord. In fact, Jesus taught this, that we should love God. Matthew 22:34 through 40. It says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." These 2 most important commandments have something in common: love. And the greatest one is to love God, love the Lord. In fact, Jesus' disciple John wrote about loving God means loving his Son. 1 John 5 verse 1, everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. And in fact, Jesus expressed the same thought, though conversely, or in an opposite way, in John 15 verse 23, where he says, "He who hates me hates my Father as well." So if you love Jesus, you love God. If you hate Jesus, you hate God. If you love God, you love His Son. If you hate God, you hate His Son as well. A disciple of Jesus is one who loves both the Father and the Son. The first love of a disciple is he or she loves the Lord. The second is that they love the church. They love the church. Jesus, in fact, made this a mark of discipleship, of true discipleship. John 13, 34 and 35, Jesus says, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." The way that the world is most likely to understand that we are truly followers of Jesus is from our love for each other. John, in fact, John made it a sign of spiritual life. In 1 John 3, verse 14, says, "We know that we have passed from death to life because we love our brothers. Anyone who does not love remains in death." A couple of chapters earlier, in John 2, verses 9 through 11, John says, "Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates his brother is still in the darkness. Whoever loves his brother lives in the light, and there is nothing in him to make him stumble. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. He does not know where he is going because the darkness has blinded him." A true disciple of Jesus is one who loves his brothers and sisters, who loves his fellow disciples, who loves the church. Then also, a third love of a disciple is not only do they love the Lord and they love the church, but a true disciple loves the lost. Loves the lost. And I'm not talking about just loving them from a distance. I'm talking about loves the lost in a way that allows them to get involved with and engage the lost. Some of the great examples of this love, God the Father certainly loved the lost, didn't He? I mean, John 3:16, that most often cited and quoted of Bible passages. "For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Romans 5, verse 8, "But God demonstrates His own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." His love is demonstrated in sending Jesus to die for us. And not when we deserved it, and not because we were so good or because we were so worth it. It's because of His love for us that while we were still sinners, while we were lost, God sent Jesus to die for us. God the Father certainly loves the lost, and Jesus certainly loved the lost as well. I mean, why else would He agree to the Father's plan to come to earth and die for the lost? In Matthew 9, 35 through 38, it says, "Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When He saw the crowds, He had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then He said to His disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into His harvest field.'" Jesus shows His love by His desire to send people to make the harvest because it was plentiful. In John 15, verse 13, "Greater love has no one than this, that He lays down His life for His friends." Jesus goes on to say, "And that is what you are. You're my friends." And in a few days, He would be laying down His life for them and for us. Jesus loved the lost. God loved the lost. Paul had a great concern for the lost. He loved the lost as well. 1 Corinthians 9, 19 through 23, Paul says these words, "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I myself am not free from the law of God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Paul says, I will do whatever it takes to share the gospel message with the lost, because he loved the lost. A true disciple of Jesus is one who loves those who are lost in sin. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. A true disciple does not love the sin. He loves the sinner. And a true disciple doesn't just say, oh, well, to each his own. A true disciple loves those in sin so as to lovingly call them out of that sin. Disciples also love their families. They love their friends. They love even their enemies. But all of those other categories can fit probably into either the church or the lost. Knowing who we are to love, now the big question becomes, well, how can we display such a love? So let me share with you some thoughts on three loves, not defined, but also the three loves demonstrated. One way to demonstrate love is through worship. This actually is how we best demonstrate our love for God, is through our worship. Now, that is assuming that our worship is in harmony with what Jesus revealed. In other words, that our worship is done in spirit and in truth. John chapter 4, verse 23 and 24, like he tells the Samaritan woman at the well. And that it includes keeping his commandments. John 14, verse 15, and verse 21 and verse 23, and John 15, verse 10, other passages as well. So how do we do that? How do we best demonstrate our love for God through worship? Well, there's two primary ways that we worship God. First, we worship God through our public assemblies. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, the writer tells us this, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. When we're looking at our to-do list for the weekend and for the week, the absolute, positively, the last thing that we should even think about giving up is our time together as a family of God. That is the last. In fact, that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying here. If you look back at the Greek, if you wanted to translate it as literally as possible, what he is saying is, don't even think about it. Don't even think about giving up meeting together, as some are already in the habit of doing. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're sick that you shouldn't be here, or that you should be here, or that if you are coughing up blood that you should still come. No, I'm not saying that. There are legitimate reasons for not attending. Sometimes people have to work. As long as it's not every day or every Sunday, then we're okay. Or if you can't come on Sunday morning, you come on Sunday night. If you can't come on Sunday night, you come on Sunday morning. What I'm saying to you is, when we have a choice in the matter, the last thing we even think about, and we don't even consider it because it's not even an option, is giving up our meeting together. Because that's how when we assemble publicly, we worship God. And that's how we best show our love to God. But not only that, we also worship God not just in public assemblies, but also in private devotions. Matthew 6, verse 6, Jesus says, when you pray, do not pray standing on the street corner to be seen by men, But when you pray, go into your room, into the closet where no one else can see you. And then God, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. You know, there are times in our lives when we need to just have it be us and God. And we need to not be willing to give up those either. We need to understand how important that time is. That it's not just something we do if we find the time. It's something that we find the time to do every day. Disciples demonstrate love for God through public worship and through private devotions. But we also demonstrate our love, and these three loves, through fellowship. This is how we can best demonstrate our love for the church. And please understand that when I say fellowship, I'm not just talking about Sunday and Wednesday. Okay? Sunday and Wednesday, we get together and we may have fellowship, but its primary purpose is to worship God. Fellowship needs to be something that is done not just on Sunday and Wednesday, but when it comes to Sunday and Wednesday, we again take Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, and we take it very literally, and we don't even think about giving up meeting on those days when the elders have said we need to come together to draw strength from each other and to share in that time of worship and of fellowship. But we are to fellowship with one another in two ways. One way is by coming together as a church for the Lord's Supper, for our giving and preaching and singing and praying and other means of encouraging each other. But we also need to fellowship with each other by extending hospitality to one another. 1 Peter 4, verses 8 and 9. Very direct, very pointed. Peter speaks about hospitality. And in fact, he uses the words, practice hospitality. Practice means we may not have it down perfectly, but we still do it anyway. Practice means that even if my house is a wreck and a shambles and I try to clean it up, but it doesn't look spick and span, I still invite people into that home to share in times of fellowship with me. Practice means that I don't just stick with the people that I know from church, that I hang around with from church, that sit around me at church, but that I expand it. And I invite the people that I don't know so well from church into my home so that I get to know them better. Practicing hospitality means that I extend that hospitable invitation to others, not just to the people that I know about and that I always hang around with. Disciples demonstrate their love for the church through fellowship, both in church and in the home. So the three loves demonstrated through worship, how we demonstrate our love for God. Through fellowship, how we demonstrate our love for the church. And then finally, through evangelism. There is no better way to demonstrate our love for the lost than through evangelism. Jesus showed his compassion in this way by teaching the lost. Matthew 9, 35 and 36, we read that passage earlier. And then in 37 through 38, Jesus calls for us to pray that there will be people who go out and evangelize the lost. That's what send out workers into his harvest field really means. By demonstrating and sending out workers. Now there are two ways that we can show our concern for the lost, our love for the lost. One is through personal evangelism. 1 Peter 3:15, John 1, 45 and 46. Encourage us to evangelize. People say, but I don't know what I would say if I was evangelizing. And besides, isn't that the preacher's job? No, it's not the preacher's job. Actually, it is the preacher. It is the preacher's job. But you want to look at the strictest interpretation of Greek words that as they appear in the New Testament. I'm not the only preacher in this congregation. You are a preacher. A preacher is just a herald of good news. And my friends, You have good news to share with your friends, with your family, with your enemies, with everyone that you have contact with on a daily basis. Let me put it this way. If your friend's house was on fire, okay, and you knew that your friend was inside that house and that they were fast asleep because it was kind of late at night, but their house was on fire and they're in the house sleeping, would you say, oh, well, I guess they'll figure it out eventually and get out safely? How many of you would do that? No one would do that. What would you do? You would go and you would wake your friend up. You would do whatever it took to get your friend to wake up so that they could get out of the house. Folks, our friends are in danger. Their house may not be on fire, but they are in danger of something far, far worse. They are in danger of an eternity separated from God Almighty. Why on earth will we not try to wake them up? Why on earth will we not try to reach out to them and get them to understand that there is something so much better? We can show our concern for the lost through personal evangelism. We can also show our love for the lost, our concern for the lost, through supporting foreign missions and evangelists. Romans 10, 14 and 15, Paul speaks about having that type of support. But you know what? Sometimes foreign missions may mean simply that they speak a different language than we do. You might say, well, wait a second. How am I going to reach out and evangelize with somebody who doesn't speak the same language that I do? There is a way. The way that you do it is you find somebody who does speak that language and you do everything you can to help and support them as they reach out. Not in a far-off country, but in a community in the community in which you live. Disciples demonstrate love for the lost by engaging in both local and foreign evangelism. And we can go a long way toward becoming true disciples of Jesus by loving the Lord, by loving the church, and by loving the lost. And we go a long way in demonstrating such a love through public worship and private devotion, through fellowship both at the church building and in our homes, and through engaging in both local and foreign evangelism. The problem is that many Christians love only partially. You know, they worship God in public, but if you go and you look at them on a day-to-day basis, you wouldn't even know that they care much about God, based on the way that they talk, the way that they dress, the way that they go about carrying themselves in their day-to-day life. Except on Sunday. On Sunday, they go to church. They fellowship at church, but not in their homes. You know, they say, well, you know what? Church people are good so long as they're kept in the church building. But if you let them out, no, I don't want anything to do with them. Or they evangelize at home, but do nothing to support evangelism abroad. Or vice versa. I know of some people whose sincere thought is, so long as they as a congregation are writing a check that goes to a missionary somewhere overseas, then they are doing their part to spread the gospel into all the world, even though they're not doing anything to spread the gospel right there in their own backyard. Folks, we've got to understand that the world includes our own backyard. And we are called to share the gospel with everyone. Every part of creation, every person, even those who are in our own backyard. No matter how much we love as disciples of Christ, we can always improve. We're never going to get it right. We're never going to love perfectly. But that doesn't need to stop us from trying. Philippians 1:9, Paul writes to the church at Philippi, "And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight." They didn't have it perfectly, but they were going to keep on doing it, and their love was to abound more and more, become greater and greater. And my prayer is that this lesson can provide direction for us on how we can improve our love in these three areas. So what about you? How are you doing at loving the Lord? How are you doing at loving the church? How are you doing at loving the lost? For many of us, those first two are pretty easy. It's that last one that kind of trips us up a bit. It trips us up because we feel that if we're going to love the lost and if we're going to try to evangelize the lost, then we have to be judgmental of the lost. And they're going to see us as being judgmental. No, they're not. Because, Jesus, when he was reaching out to lost people, he reached out in love with a genuine concern for that person. When the woman who was caught in the act of adultery was thrown before Jesus, and he stooped down and he wrote things and he said, "Whoever's without sin, throw the first stone." And one by one, starting with the oldest down to the youngest, those people who were trying to accuse her and trying to trap Jesus left. When it was just him and her, did he say, "Hey, I got you out of this one"? No. He said, "Where are those who have accused you?" They've gone. He said, "Neither do I accuse you. Get up now and go and leave your life of sin." He didn't chastise her. He simply called her to leave her life of sin. Friends, if you're caught in a life of sin, then that's what we call you to do this morning, is to leave that life of sin. Leave that life of sin and start living a life that is lived for God, where you love God, you love the church, and you love the lost. If you're here this morning and you're not loving God, the Lord, you're not loving the church, you're not loving the lost, repent. Repent and start doing that. Maybe to do that you need to privately respond where you're at. A private response is okay. Maybe you need to make a public response. And that's okay too. The bottom line is, don't leave here the same as you came. Leave here more convinced than ever that you're going to love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That you're going to love the church and fellowship with the church, and that you're going to love the lost, and you're going to show them how much you love them by evangelizing. If we can help you in some way to better show that love through a public response, then why don't you let us know by coming to the front as we stand and sing together.